how can you manage Kubernetes in a little bit more of an efficient way? Well, using things like kubectl, using the command line, yeah, these things definitely work, but it's very, very difficult to scale that, just a bunch of Kubernetes commands. And that's why, for example, you're seeing more people deploying via Argo CD and GitOps solutions versus running kubectl apply -f, or as clusters are being troubleshooted, they're getting their data captured in monitoring and observability tools versus just running a whole bunch of kubectl log and kubectl apply commands or kubectl describe commands. So in this video, I want to show you a different way to do things with the resource browser from Devtron. Now, there are two different methods that you can use to get the resource browser up and running. First, you can install it in a standalone fashion. So let's say you don't want all of Devtron's capabilities, you can install the resource browser by itself. So you can kind of think about it like, instead of using something like OpenLens, you would use Devtron instead for the resource browser. Or you can do just the full deployment, right? So you can do something like this. Even if you don't want to use the GitOps and the CI/CD pieces, you can just install Devtron and then you have all of the capabilities there. So if I head over to my browser, we can see that I'm currently in Devtron and this is a new installation and deployment. So we see all these different capabilities here, but I want to focus on the resource browser. So I click on the resource browser and the first thing that I see is my clusters. So what I can do is I can click on the default cluster. That's where Devtron is currently installed, or I can add a cluster. So when you add a cluster, I would click add cluster. I would specify, well, actually I have two different methods that I can specify here. Either the server URL and the bearer token, which we can pull that, or you can do it directly from a kube config, right? So I think this is definitely a little bit easier of a solution here. So if I click on how to find it for the cluster browser or the cluster provider, we can actually see here, if I just run this command, it's going to paste out the token for me and the URL. So I can just pop that information in here. Now again, the other thing that you can do is you can use the resource browser right on the cluster that Devtron is installed on, which would make sense. Now, one of the things that I'll just point out here is if you're installing Devtron on a cluster, chances are you'd want to install it on a cluster that's not running application workloads. So maybe something like your control plane or your management cluster. Like for example, if you're installing Argo CD, you would probably install it, well, not probably, well, you should at least definitely install it on a management cluster, okay? And that way you can manage everything from one cluster and have your application deployments occurring in another cluster, all right? So right off the bat, we can see we have our nodes here, and these are the worker nodes that are running because I'm running an AKS, so I don't have access to the control plane. Now we can see various pieces of information, the status, the roles, the errors, the versions, and then the node groups. And if I click on one of these nodes, again, we can see the node overview, even including things like the IP address. We can see labels, annotations, any taints if they exist, and then observability information, or rather resource information like CPU, memory, etc. You can even actually drain and coordinate a node here, which is really cool. I don't think I've ever actually seen this in a GUI-based tool like this. So that's definitely very, very cool, right? So the next thing that you can do is you can take a look at events that are occurring on your cluster and all of the namespaces on your cluster. So you get a lot of information just from the cluster, but chances are you're probably going to want to also dive into the various Kubernetes objects or kinds, right? And they are all categorized here for you. So for example, you have workloads for things like deployments, jobs, and pods. You have config and storage for config maps, persistent volumes, secrets, storage classes. You have networking for slices and ingress and services. You have RBAC to handle everything and anything permission related, anything administration for webhooks, other resources, and custom resources, which are really cool. So for example, you have application here, and this is really awesome because this is actually specific for any custom resource definition. So this isn't something that's, a resource built into Kubernetes like the pods are, for example. This is actually any custom resources that may be running or could be running in your environment. So first things first, let's go ahead and look at an existing configuration, and then we're going to look at how to deploy a new configuration. So if I click on pods and I choose, well, we'll choose a random one here. Maybe we'll go to Argo CD application controller. So as soon as you click on it, well, actually, let me go back here. You can see all of the different information in terms of the namespace, how many pods are running, if it's running or not, and any resources, or I'm sorry, any restarts that occurred. So if we, for example, just again, click on, I think it was the application controller, I want to say, right off the bat, you see the live manifest. Now you could also edit the manifest if you wanted to. Of course, I highly recommend if you do any edits, put them into your source control, but you can edit the Kubernetes manifest that's deploying this pod right here. Another thing that you can do is you can take a look at any events that are occurring. So if you run like a kubectl describe on a pod, for example, these are the events that you would see. If you ran a kubectl logs on the pod, these are the events that you would see. And if possible, you can even connect to the terminal. So I'm literally in the pod for the application controller, right? Now, of course, there's probably not a lot of commands that are going to be working in here because it's a watered down version, right? It doesn't need a full version of Linux or anything like that. Point being is there are a lot of different pieces of information here, and this is actually really cool. You can even do bash, PowerShell, CMD. Is there PowerShell here? Let's see. Nope. CMD? Nope. Bash? Ah, there it is. Yes, we got a little bash action here. So we got bash, we got sh, a lot of different ways to interact with these pods. So point being is this, as you're interacting with these pods, you have capabilities that you would, yes, have on the terminal, but they're easier to kind of manage from this GUI. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to show how to create a resource. So if we click on this blue button here, we can actually import any YAML that we would like. So just as an example here, maybe I'll paste in just a static pod, nginx pod. So we'll go ahead and we'll click apply. And as we can see, that was created. We'll go ahead and we'll click close. And then I'm going to go back to the resource browser. I'm going to go to my pods. And as you can see, the container is creating. So if we click on it, for example, and we go into the terminal, we can see, boom, it's up and running. We can do an ls. We can see we're in our pod for nginx. So there's a lot of different capabilities here, not only read capabilities, but also write capabilities. And it gives you a chance to see a different way to work with Kubernetes outside of the command line. This is even great for teams that maybe don't know the Kubernetes command line, but need the ability and access to manage certain things in Kubernetes. Maybe if this is your platform engineering environment or internal developer platform, this can be used for the developers to use Kubernetes a little bit, even from a GUI perspective.